I think this panel, I hope, will be quite exciting. We've been talking about, and Steve mentioned this to me just a second ago, we've been talking about the issue that the panelists focused on pretty well throughout the conference. So I think it's sort of a bit of serendipity that this has come up rather organically. The panel was originally called looking at corporate governance and populism and nationalism, and I think we're going to have a discussion. It's probably easier to talk about it more in terms of just geopolitics. And instead of doing this with having presentations, we had a Zoom call and we've exchanged some emails. And our Zoom call was so interesting and exciting that I thought we would just have the conversation in the room with you guys and get you to sort of pitch in rather than doing individual presentations, because I think there is in fact a number of issues and points that have come up throughout the event, and that we'll just sort of chime in, and I will try to lead with some questions. But I guess as a starting frame, I think we all realize that we're in a different moment. And Steve brought up in an email response after our Zoom call that, of course, geopolitics isn't new, right? There's a long history of geopolitics and corporate law and geopolitics and corporate governance. But I do think the current era, we're all probably in agreement, although I would love to hear some disagreement as well. But at least I think the way we all saw it, but I'll seek out their views more directly, is that there's a different salience in terms of the way that geopolitics is driving corporate law and corporate governance these days, right? And I think Chris will talk a bit about TSMC from Taiwan, right? Like, it's fascinating to think, if you're a lawyer and you just look at the legal structure of TSMC, you see that 70% of the shareholders are foreign, are non-Taiwanese. 5 of the board directors, which make up a majority, are American. If you look at control, you look at the board, you think, okay, this is a very sort of, maybe a non-Taiwanese company. But then if you look at, I would say you'd be hard-pressed to think of a company that is more Taiwanese or more crucial to Taiwan than TSMC, right? And it's not because necessarily of the corporate law. I think it is because of the obvious geopolitical importance of TSMC and the non-corporate law regulations, right, that bring the national identity of TSMC to the floor, or to the fore. If you take another example, U.S. Nippon Steel, right? And you look at it as that transaction as a corporate lawyer, just through a legal lens. What do you see? Nippon Steel bought 100% of the equity in U.S. Steel. But then Donald Trump decided he wanted a special golden share. Yeah? And the golden share is not just giving the President of the United States the office special veto rights over many different areas of corporate governance. It gives Donald J. Trump himself different rights than the next President of the United States would get. So again, there is this extreme politicization, if I'll get that word out, yeah? Politics entering into corporate law. And yes, we've seen things like golden shares in the past, but have we seen something like that? I would challenge anybody to find something like the Donald J. Trump veto power share, right? We've mentioned Sheen a bunch of times throughout this, and Sheen is extremely interesting because I often think of Sheen, I brought them up once or twice, right? This hyper-efficient company on one hand, which has just, producing 50 to 60 times the number of unique products as Zara and H&M, completely out-competing, no storefront in the United States, dominating the market, a company which nobody had heard of a decade ago. But then what do you see? You see actually most of their reorg, their corporate chart has been wound down in China and reemerged in Singapore through this thing called Singapore washing. And in fact, the founder became Singaporean. This was not done for efficiency. This is counter-efficiency. Their secret sauce is in mainland China, and they're doing things, why? To wash their mainland identity. But recently, there's been a reversal of this, where China has, the founder was summoned back. The founder of Shein, it's fascinating. You couldn't find a picture of him on the internet, had never made a public speech. And recently he made his first sort of big public speech in China, reaffirming his Chinese roots. I don't want to be a skeptic, and I know this is all recorded by our nice friends, but you know, it's interesting to think they were denied an IPO in New York and then denied an IPO in London, and now Hong Kong is opening up as this final shot at the IPO. I'll let you decide why the speech was made, but it's interesting, right? It's interesting. And Arjya will talk about the Shein India aspect, which is also fascinating because we get fixated, I think, on the geopolitic China-US. But I don't think it's that, right? That is a huge part of it. But China-India, US-Europe, now we're in the war, right? And the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, and China and India are having their own concerns with the US and how this is going to affect. So this is definitely US-China, but I would argue that it is definitely global. You take another, and I'll just give maybe as a last example, right, which is unavoidable in a conversation about geopolitics and corporate governance, is TikTok. So Curtis and I, and a lot of these points actually are, you know, we look at all of these cases, Curtis, Mariana, and I, in this upcoming paper I've mentioned, but earlier than that, Curtis and I put out something on TikTok just before the Supreme Court heard the case, and we rushed to get it out in December. And we made the point, if you look at the org chart of TikTok as a lawyer, looking at just the place of incorporation, where the entity is, where the management is, the classic legal frame, it's not Chinese. It's a super clear case, okay? But of course, that's not the way that the US Supreme Court or Congress ended up defining it. They defined it as Chinese. And why? It had to do with access to data, national security risk. Okay, so this was again, you're hobbled as a lawyer to be able to deal with this, or at least a corporate lawyer, you know, from that lens. So, you know, there are other different things that are also happening. This idea where you used to vet a foreign company from coming in at the start, you know, either you deny them entry or you allow it. What we see is also a lot more midstream interference, right? So, you know, another fascinating case is one of Pirelli, an old Italian tire company where a state-owned enterprise 10 years ago became its largest shareholder, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And they were happy to take the money then. No issue. And maybe this shows how times have changed. What recently happened? To cut a long story short, the Italian government used something called golden power, and they basically took away the largest shareholders' voting rights to maybe allow access to the US market. Actually, Umakan had brought up an example just in the discussion before. It was very interesting, saying, you know, if, you know, I think it was Alibaba he mentioned, or Tencent owning part of an Indian company. Well, if they own 10%, is that an Indian company or not? So I think we have this idea. One is that geopolitics, of course, is changing our world. I don't think we're moving globalization to decoupling. I think everybody realizes we can't do that. People talk about managed interdependence, like the way that the TikTok ended was managed interdependence, but I don't know if that's even a strong enough word. Maybe it's weaponized interdependence, which is a new, in the geopolitic literature, the word they're using, okay, it's really weaponized. Sometimes it goes beyond managed. And so that's sort of the frame, and now I want to sort of open it up to questions, right? You know, and the first question is the one that Steve brought up, actually, and I've sort of alluded to, is to say how much of this is actually new, right? So I think we have to ask the question about, you know, and in fact, Mariana many times has reminded me about this over the last year, and maybe also me at the start saying, oh, yeah, this is new, but it's not new, right? So how much do you feel in India, Australia, Taiwan, are we in, you know, am I getting this wrong? Are we in a new age? Is this a fair assumption to make? And if we're in a new age, why do we call it new? Because obviously there's been, you know, I don't have to tell somebody from Taiwan, there's been geopolitical issues for a long time, right? So you know, this is an issue, and it's come up. And if we go back to wartime periods, you see an ebb and flow over time. So are we in a new time? Is it just that we forgot about this? We've woken up as academics. I know we've actually talked to people on boards, and I've been talking to people on boards. I can tell you in this room, if we think back to the first Asia Corporate Law Forum, the word geopolitics, I don't think came up. I don't think it was ever raised. And quite organically, over the last 2 days, I don't know that it didn't come up in almost any talk. So I think just if I use that as a signal, I will put 1 point on the scorecard for saying this is intuitively correct. But I want to hear from each one of you to start the conversation. So I'll just hand it down the row, and I'll start with Steve, since Steve brought this issue up first with a bit of pushback. Yeah.
I don't remember bringing it up, but it's always a good way to win the argument when you say, tell me I'm wrong. I'm not going to, I'm going to, I think that, yeah, I don't think that conceptually it is new. I mean, the corporation has always inherently been political. I mean, I think what is new is the recognition after a long period of 30 or 40 years that corporations and corporate law are not neutral. And so I think this is a big change. I mean, I was reading Harwell Wells again, you know, his work, and I have a nice quote here from the Eisenhower era when he was appointing the Secretary of Defense, General Motors President Charles Wilson, and he tells Congress that for years I thought what was good for our country was good for General Motors and vice versa. I mean, this idea of companies being linked to some kind of national success is long-standing, and I think that we forgot it beginning in the 1970s because we had a message that if your corporation is going out and succeeding in the world, it is doing well for the country, even though we don't talk about it. So I think that itself was a stance, a political stance, and we've kind of started to question this. That, I think, though, it is different now because we are questioning it where once we didn't. So I think the points that you I haven't read your paper, but the points that are coming out in the paper, I think, highlight how contentious it is now, where it once was not. And we have to think about it. You know, and what nationality is a company? This has always been really vexed. Like, I'm thinking of companies that we don't associate with our national security. I think, and Tamara and Jennifer may correct me here, Arnott's Biscuits. We have a biscuit company in Australia, and Michelle, and we think of this as Australian. I'm not sure that it is Australian-owned anymore, but the messaging is still, this is as Australian as you can get, right? We create these beautiful Tim Tams that I think were at the advisory board meeting, and we seem to be very proud of these biscuits, right? It's not going to change the world, but it's still part of our identity. So I think in addition to being a legal issue, a geopolitical issue, it's also a very psychological issue of what it means to identify with a nation that is coming back and as an actor. I mean, international lawyers have been looking at this for 25 years, right? The return of the state. And I think we're realizing that now in corporations law as well.
Just one point on that, like I think in the Asian context, you know, I think you're absolutely right, but what popped into my mind when you were speaking is, in the Japanese sense, there was the famous bulldog sauce case, right, where there was the attempted takeover by an American firm of bulldog sauce, which is sort of like tonkatsu, a Japanese Worcestershire sauce, right, that you dip your thing in. And it was just seen as so Japanese, right? And this actually had a big effect on the corporate transaction, right? So I do agree with you, this sense of sort of these national firms playing a role. I think with TSMC, it's interesting to think like these national firms also have taken on a different level of salience with AI and this sort of arms race, right? Like Tim Tams is one thing, but who's going to win the AI war is another thing. But just with that thought, I'll move to Arjya.
Thanks, Dan. Whether we're looking at a structural shift, I don't know if it's too early to tell, but there's certainly been some contraction, and the role of the state, as Steve said, has become more powerful. Having said that, I think there's hope on two counts. One is that given our interdependencies on capital flows, supply chain, consumption, immigrant flows, etc., I don't know whether there's going to be a full decoupling. I don't see a full decoupling happening. However, at the end of this cycle of, I'd say, statehood, we'll see where the pieces are. However, on the second count of hope that I just want to show from the Indian perspective, and Umakant raises this morning, that around the pandemic, the Indian government passed this press note saying that all investments by neighboring countries, and as he mentioned, there's only one neighboring country that actually puts investments into India, right? All investments by neighboring countries must require government approval. That was in 2020. The ostensible reason for that, given by the government at the time, was to prevent unwanted, opportunistic takeovers by neighboring countries into Indian companies. That was the formal reason. The informal reason was a bunch of skirmishes along the Indo-China border. Right? That was the informal reason, which will never be talked about. However, last month, on the 26th of March, the Indian government has sort of changed its stance a little bit. Now it's saying that if you are a company from a neighboring country, we'll allow you to invest up to 10% into an Indian company without requiring government approval. So maybe it's again too early, but maybe that's a sign of, are we going back into a 1990s liberalization phase, right?
So I'm happy you brought up that point, yeah, because I think you're right on that. We in this paper we talk about the managing interdependence, or maybe we're going to call it weaponized. So I agree. I think it's too much to decouple. And if you look at things like even you look at the Nippon-U.S. deal, that was done at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, Pirelli is still an investor. At the end of the day, Shein will still sell products, in the at the end of the day, TikTok. They've worked out an arrangement for TikTok. The fact that ByteDance has 3 billion people, right? You can't really untangle that. So you have to manage it, right? In these ways where you enter into some sort of, after bargaining and contestation, you work out some solution. And I guess the point before I hand it to Chris is, and Steve brought up the great, I think the Tim Tam point at the start, there is a lot, and we actually end up calling it in the paper, a symbolism to this, right? Like I think symbolism plays an enormous role, and symbolism is not just an academic thought. If you look at the money that some of these firms like Shein spend on PR and opening their first storefront in Paris, and who they hire as their models on their web pages, right? You see that, there's serious thought into the symbolic pitch that they set in terms of nationality. But now I'll hand it over to Chris, because I think TSMC is really one of the most consequential firms, not just in Taiwan, probably in the world. And it's a fascinating story that everybody, I think, needs to know more about.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And I think just share some thoughts. First, I think we refer to your earlier question. I think geopolitics certainly is not new. And the corporate law, I think we corporate law usually don't too much about politics, right? So it seems to be neutral, but it's something that we cannot really avoid. And but I think there could be some change due to a change of context. I think 50 years ago there was no globalization. Things are made in America, But now, in the past few decades, things did change. There are more import-export. Things are made in Asia, and still a lot of stuff made in China. And so when President Trump, I think when he first announced the tariff about a year ago, and there are some concern that whether by end of last year, whether Americans will get their Christmas decoration, which is mostly shipped from China, right? I don't know how it panned out, maybe it work. But so I think context change. And I also pick up Steve's earlier point is that a country's success can be linked to a company. And I think there's no better way to describe it by the Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, TSMC. So for those of you who had little idea about how TSMC does more than just 4 magic letters, it's the biggest contract chip maker in the world. It's not just the biggest, it's the most dominant. And I'm sorry to Korean, but we beat you again, not on baseball field. Yeah, they beat Samsung at this stage. And actually, TSMC wasn't like this. I think not so long ago, about 10-something years ago, there was a year they actually suffered losses. They even talk about cutting employees. Then the then former CEO, Morris Chang, he came back and kicked out the other CEO, then revived the company. And for whatever reason, it just beat everybody in the world. And I know TSMC doesn't make product, but I'm almost guaranteed among this room, there's probably 80% or more of the electronic that contain product from TSMC. Everything needs chips. And there are several dimensions to that. On the one hand, it's so successful that become Taiwan's basically, in Taiwan, we don't call the company TSMC. We call it our protection mountains. In Taiwan, we have a central mountain range. Wherever typhoon hit Taiwan, by the way, it passed Taiwan, it get weakened. So it's a kind of the divine mountain range. And it's a metaphor, TSMC like a protection of Taiwan against, China. And so some, and also call it silicon shield. Because TSMC, even though its customers are everywhere in the world, the production base are still predominantly in Taiwan, which means that one missile can destroy the world. And in case you wonder, it's not about the phone. If you use any AI, NVIDIA's GPU are basically made by TSMC. Even Google, I think Gemini is wonderful. Google has its own TPU, right? TPU designed by Broadcom, but chips are actually made by TSMC as well. They don't announce it, it's a very low-key company. And so it becomes the dominant force in not just Taiwan, it's also in the world's electronic business. And it's not just about national pride, it's also actually one of the rare chances we get a global champion. And I think in terms of politics, I think on the one hand it's about US-China, and on the other hand, during COVID-19, actually the company's power are brought to the fore. So during COVID-19 was a disruption of global supply chain, and as it turns out, a lot of German car makers, they don't have chips. If you don't have chips, then you can have those not so smart. Nowadays, most vehicles are basically electronics, right? No handbrake, it's an electronic handbrake. You need chips for that. And so that's when the government stepped in to kind of say, can TSMC produce something more for, let's say, Mercedes or Volkswagen? And I think by that point of time, people realized TSMC is such a dominant force. And unavoidably got a bit entangled with politics. So I will talk more about something about their board in the next session, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But last year, about March, I think there was a big news. TSMC announced it will make a huge investment in Arizona, in Phoenix. And so the CEO of TSMC, Chairman Wei, stood next to President Trump. Actually, behind the scenes are our economic officials, stay on the second row. So it just signal, I think, the company itself, even though it comes from a small island, it's just not just a national chain, something really big, but it's also now become a focal point where it plays a very strategic role in not just economics, but also in even indirectly will affect global politics and how, or in regional politics will affect how TSMC might function. So I don't run too much time. Maybe we'll save time to talk more about TSMC later. But there's another Taiwanese champion. So it's just right next to the hotel. It's a Taiwanese love to eat. So we have our proud Ding Tai Fung. Ding Tai Fung, funny enough, actually the food itself is not Taiwanese cuisine. The cuisine itself is more Shanghai style. That's why you get dumplings, those kind of stuff. And amazingly, Ding Tai Fung's most well-known thing is actually not dumpling. It's their fried rice. So to the point, good Taiwanese will say, okay, our fried rice is as good as Ding Tai Fung. But anyway, Ding Tai Fung is another story. You get a famous Chen. It doesn't hit politics, but it is something that from a small island, it is something to a globally, and individually it shaped what maybe local Taiwanese or other people would see Taiwan. And so maybe eventually back to Dan's question, I think for TSMC, maybe a little bit more on corporate governance if interested. It's just that our law eventually copy-paste from Anglo-American model. But in a way, TSMC is very unique in terms of corporate governance. So they are truly special in certain regard to really install the idea of those Western idea of corporate governance into a Taiwanese firm compared with all other local companies. I think I should rest for now, then we can pick up more later.
So just, I guess one fascinating point I think you raised, Chris, is this idea that, yeah, 50 years ago, I think the level of integration, right? Of course, the hyper-globalization that occurred has made us at a different time in terms of, you can't fully unwind to go back to the other point. But I do think, before we shift tact a little bit, that there is something else that is new, which is the preeminence of data as being sort of the coin of the realm of many companies, right? So, if you think of data, it's a different type of asset in a few respects, right? One is it ties very much into personal information and data security, right? Who would have guessed, say, 10 years ago that people would be deciding whether or not you are, TikTok is acceptably or a Chinese company or not, by looking at where its data is stored, right, and who has access to his data. But of course, this is all relevant now to defining the company because of the national security risk that poses, right? So even when companies do Singapore washing, Singapore doesn't want more data centers because of the energy and all of this. But it's interesting that big Chinese companies may be able to host want to maybe put a data center in Singapore, even if they move their organization, their real seat, their management center. I need to say this because of Aurelio Comey, and these sort of things, right? Data becomes important. But I want to change tack a little bit and ask a second question, which is probably what we were thinking about at the first Asia Corporate Law Forum was, and even the second, was a lot about sustainability. And we still talked about that in this forum, right? But I saw this fascinating quote from Bloomberg, and it wasn't a quote as much as a rebranding of the acronym ESG. So a Bloomberg article just, I think it was 3 or 4 days ago, referred to ESG as economics, security, and geopolitics. And so the question I have comes from that, yeah? How strong is economic security and geopolitics in your jurisdictions, right? Is this displacing ESG? And I think, I don't want to misquote Steve again, but I seem to recall from one of Steve's emails that he said something about ESG being hard to displace, that it's not just a set of rules, but it's more like we were talking about before, it's part of an ecosystem, right? I know that Arjya brought up stuff with Iran and the war in India, and of course, when I was in India just a few months ago, my driver, he was laughing because we stopped at a gas station that I didn't recognize the brand, and he said it's a Russian gas station. And I said, I thought Russia didn't deliver oil here anymore. And he said, that never stopped. So it's quite interesting, right? So, how much, climate and sustainability, is this going to be pushed aside because of geopolitics, right? Because, of course, they don't have to be counteractive forces, but sometimes, if you're if you're worried about, the price of electricity, if you're worried about, getting electricity at all, maybe you go back to coal because oil's too hard to get, right? And so are we in an era now where, geopolitics is going to push ESG to the side, or are they mutually, can they coexist, or do they reinforce each other? So I'll just go to Steve, since I thought you brought up this point as well.
Sounds really ominous, or this discussion with the thunder in the background. It's like geopolitics. So it's, I think the points that I made in the email really were, our definition of ESG is important. I mean, first of all, I think ESG always had a technical definition that was somehow linked to economics, at least. Some people interpreted ESG as somehow linked to the financial success of the corporation. I think that's still relevant. It doesn't go away. Insofar as environment and social matters continue to be important and potentially impact or affect the corporation's financial success, then it just simply doesn't go away. We may focus on it less because we're distracted by something more immediate, but it remains there. It remains in the law. I was saying in Australia, the duty of care. Still, directors still need to consider the financial success of the company, and if they've got assets that need to be kind of abandoned and stuff, that remains. They can't ignore that, no matter what is happening in a geopolitical sense. And then the point that I think that you were raising was my second, which is ESG had a broader meaning as well, which was more in line with the historical linked to corporate social responsibility, corporate purpose, a sense of corporations doing good or not doing bad. And I think that's difficult to displace. People will still argue about what is the role of the corporation, should it be acting in a particular way, and there will be a debate and on that won't leave. And in particular, if the focus starts to move too much into, let's forget about ESG, there will be a portion of the population that will respond to that. And so it's an ongoing dialogue, I think.
So I think just, also you made me think of the first panel on the first day. For people who weren't here in the first session, I think there was one thing that came up in the public forum a bit was the idea that maybe Asia is different, right? That there hasn't been a displacement, a U-turn like we've seen in the US, right? That really within Asia, this movement towards, at least on the climate front, sustainability is something that is staying the course. I think Andrew actually probably raised the most poignant example, talking about how, Taiwan is really doubling down, that it's becoming very real in Taiwan, if I recall correctly, right? So I guess before I hand it over to Arjya, just to remember that, right? That I think that was one of the findings. And when I was at National Taiwan on the Trump 2.0 panel a while back, it was the same consensus, right? But with what's happening in the war now, I do think maybe we're in a different time. Yeah, again, right? And the question is this now going to push us beyond, this comfortable feeling where we can stay the course, right? Or for a lack of better terms, is the ship going to turn around? Yes, sure, of course. Yeah.
Because I think you raised the distinction between Asia and what's happening currently in America. I think that we need to look more closely at America and environmental laws and history. It's never been a one-way, progression. It has always been a battle of interests within America as to whether environmental laws are promoted or other interests are promoted. And so I don't think that we should dismiss America as just completely moving back. There are people within America who continue to advocate environmental and other goals as well.
Thanks, Steve. I just want to connect a couple of dots here. To an extent, Bloomberg might be right, except for, from the Indian point of view, E stands for energy right now. We are dependent on the Gulf of Hormuz. About 80% of our crude comes from there, about 65% of our LPG comes from there, and the Indian government is right now ringing, alarm bells. There's been a silver lining, though. in the last few weeks, we've sort of pivoted our energy sort of requirements away from petroleum to an extent to coal, because that's readily available, but also to renewable. So in a way, the US-Israel-Iranian war is actually pushing more of that environmental mandate for the supply of energy through renewable means. This is being championed by a bunch of state-owned enterprises, and our friends from Monash would recognize them by Adani. Adani is a major player in solar right now. What's also happening is digitization of a public infrastructure onto which we're building our sort of electrical supply as a seamless interconnected network. So in a way, the US-Iranian war is, much like in Taiwan, is getting us to be a little more resilient. So that just goes back to our earlier point on guarded interdependence, perhaps, Dan? Chris?
Yeah, I think a very interesting idea, the new acronym for ESG. So I just share some of my thoughts. I think in Taiwan, I think the government, we are not anti-ESG, at least on the government level. The stock change is still very much a push for all sorts of things we discussed in the past few years, from ESG to like stewardship code, whatever. They're still actively in that. Sometimes I wonder whether they gone a bit too far, but we're still on that track. So not like a U-turn in America. But I do think in terms of ES, especially E and G, I think it's more than just the environment and governance. So for example, I think, I don't represent all the Taiwanese investors, but as far as I understand, we Taiwanese people care only about one thing most, is share price will go up, right? So that's economic. If share price will go up, everybody is happy. If share price go up, nobody care about environment. Yeah, I mean, I'm of course exaggerating now. So it is ultimately, I think that's something I'm a bit reserved is how much people actually care about those ESG stuff if the company is not doing very well. Does it really make sense? So I think from Taiwan's point of view, I think I suppose probably most people will care about their wealth ahead of some other benchmark. But having said that, TSMC again is actually kind of leader in that. Their certain reporting, etc., are pretty good by standard. But there's another dimension to it. So my colleagues actually suspicious that's what the government wants, is that they push for ESG. It's not just because of ESG. They kind of induce capital market to go toward that direction so they can support green energy. So there has been every now and then some argument. For example, we have plenty of tech companies, not just TSMC. They consume so much water and energy. Taiwan is not an island short of water. We have a lot of water rainfall, but we just cannot keep it. So always short of water, and we don't produce oil. We don't have energy. So actually, our natural gas come from Qatar. So I think it's a matter of time before we got cut off. Yeah, and it's government heavily subsidized. But anyway, one argument was that okay, there are some politicians saying that why should we go for green energy? We have a huge offshore wind farm project in the middle of Taiwan Strait, and but some suggest tech company need to buy that. Their argument is that the Apollo supply chain, they want green energy, therefore TSMC will need to use green energy, and in turn it will benefit green energy companies. So that's one theory. So I think in the end of the day, it will come down to economic. And but maybe it has some interaction with some environmental effect. So I will share maybe just another thing about governance. So we speak so much of TSMC, but I should caution you, TSMC is an outlier by Taiwanese standard. So I got a little chance to talk to some TSMC people in January, because like Professor Chung here, I'm already nominated, will be an interim director of TSMC's subsidiary. Not TSMC itself, it's an affiliate company. And so I got a chance to talk to their chief legal officer, chief financial officer, and then eventually their vice chairman. So for me, it's like I live in Taipei all the time, but the TSMC wasn't in Taipei. And I feel like I was a kind of local, rural area people walking into like God-given gift to Taiwan, right? TSMC. And the company is truly special because the reason why they interview any candidate they want to nominate, they want to know how I will behave as independent directors. So I'm technically US, UK trained, even though my LB is in Taiwan. I spent in Singapore long enough, so I pretty much brainwashed by common law. So I don't buy that rubber stamp story, right? But that's actually what they want. My friend doesn't give me the tip, but actually they want people who are vocal enough to say something. But 99% of other Taiwanese friends, I guarantee they want somebody who just basically do what the chairman says, like maybe typical in many Asian jurisdictions. So I think maybe, I don't think the company itself had changed the whole Taiwan by a lot, but maybe it serves as a signal, as in Dan talked before, right? Maybe it serves as a signal. It's a gold standard in terms of corporate governance. Like what they mentioned earlier, it has plenty of institutional investors. The market cap is top 10 in the world, and it has more. It's probably the only company that has more independent directors than non-independent ones, and most of them are foreigners. And that made the company truly unique, but it hasn't quite changed the whole corporate scene yet. But it could be a signal. That's something we can observe in the future. Yep, expect.
So unfortunately, the time went very, very quickly. So what I'm going to do is, we had one last question, but I'm not going to go over time and answer it, just to get you guys to think about it. So we were going to discuss, as a last possible question, a quote from the CEO of US Steel. And there's actually a great quote from the CEO where he declared that a fiduciary duty, that he had a fiduciary duty to the national security interest, right? And so I think it's interesting to think, I haven't seen any Delaware decision that creates such a duty, but to get the CEO to sort of declare this shows that, you know, this is an issue that is going through the minds of boards of directors at, you know, many companies around the world. Is, you know, how do we navigate this world of geopolitics and national security, and how do boards deal with this, which is exactly the, you know, it touches on the last paper that Chris is going to give. So I think it's a good segue into that. Before we wrap up the panel, I just want to say Yeti from, Ibu Yeti from UI, University of Indonesia, she was supposed to be on this panel with us, but she had some personal matters, so she sends her apologies, and we would have loved to have her here because the Indonesian story would have been equally as fascinating. But with that, I just thank all of you, and we will now move to Chris talking to us more about geopolitics.